Okay, welcome to part C of session 22. Okay, so I just talked about how goldsmiths might keep gold in their shop, give out these notes saying, I promise you to pay 1 ounce of gold or whatever. And then those little notes would be like money. They were essentially paper money. It turns out that's the way paper money used to be in the United States, that it was a promise to pay you, the bearer, whoever had this note. You could come in and cash that paper note for a certain amount of gold, or it turns out also silver. U.S. used both. And in fact, let me show you. So I got this from the internet. This is what paper money in the U.S. Used to look like. Let's see if we can see this. Okay. Note on this is an old $10 bill. This is from 1929. It says, "Will pay to the bearer on demand $10." Now we all use paper money. We say, well, wait, that is $10. That paper money. Well, in the old days, they didn't think that way. They thought, no, this is just a note that promised real money, and real money would be gold or silver, and the government would set a price that the gold is worth an ounce of gold is worth $35, whatever it is. And so whatever they had set this, and you owned this note that said we the government will pay you $10, that would meant you would give 10/35 of an ounce of gold, something like that. If you could cash it in and get that. In fact, not only that, here's another note. If you look at this one at the bottom, so this is $10 in gold coin payable to the bearer on demand. Okay, so this one explicitly said you can get gold for this. Now, sometime around the early 70s, the U.S. went off the gold standard. And there was a transition. For a while, they wouldn't pay normal people, but they would pay foreign governments if they demanded these green pieces of paper for gold. But then, even in the early 70s, I think it was 71 Nixon, maybe his executive order, I'm not sure, it might have been a law passed by Congress, whatever the case, the U.S. went off the gold standard. So all of a sudden now these notes cannot be transferred into gold or silver with the government. But at least at first, the key point is I want you to know these things, these bills we carry around in our wallets. Lots of us do, although lots of us have stopped doing that. We use credit cards. But 20 years ago, everyone would have had these green notes of paper that we'd carry around in our wallet. And the point is, though, in the old days, that they were just like those little IOUs that the goldsmiths would give to people. Okay. Now, okay. What we're going to talk about now is, or eventually our goal for this chapter is to talk about measuring the total quantity of money that's in, say, the U.S. system. We call it the money supply. Okay, now, as you can see, it's not as simple as just, even in the old days when there were just goldsmiths, the total amount of money is not necessarily equal to the amount of gold. If these goldsmiths can lend to other people and write this paper money, the total money, as we saw, can be much higher than the total amount of gold. Okay, so it's a little tricky how to measure the total amount of money. Okay, now what economists have done, they realize that. They say, okay, it's a little tricky, and we might want to use different definitions at different times. And so that's what economists do. So they have one definition, specific way. They call it M1. Okay, M1. So money one. Okay, this is under this definition, the total amount of money is currency. Okay, this is the total amount of coins, total value of all the coins out in the economy, plus the total amount of all the bills, plus all the checking deposits. Okay, and the idea is that these checks, I think all of us use. Okay, when we write a check, that's like a piece of paper, and the bank is saying, I owe you, whoever that check goes to, I owe you whatever is the amount on that check. And it's just like those IOUs from the goldsmiths. And so when the bank does that, these things have the same power to buy things as these green pieces of paper we carry around. So the checks work just like the currency. So we count that in M1. That's part of the kind of the most direct way of measuring money. We include that in this most direct way. That's part of M1. And then the final point, they call it traveler's checks. Don't even worry about those things. So it turns out that when economists talk about M1, they still count traveler's checks. I haven't heard of anyone using this. The last time I heard of anyone using traveler's checks was sometime probably early 70s. I remember my father was about to go on some business trip overseas, and he had bought, I think it's from American Express, these traveler's checks. And the idea is that these things could be used like money when you go overseas. I have no idea how they work anymore. I've never heard of anyone using them. The book mentions that they're part of M1. Don't worry about it. By the way, for an exam, I don't want you to have to memorize these things, but what's exactly is in M1, what's exactly in M2. But what I do want you to know is that it's a little tricky, and it's sometimes a little vague about what's the proper way to count money. Okay. And for that reason, the government uses more than one definition, M1, M2, I think there's M3, M4, and so on. But the one that's the most basic is M1, and this includes only the things that you would think of, the simplest things of what you'd count as money. Okay, and the key is currency and checking deposits at a bank. Okay, M2. Okay. This adds, okay, it is M1 plus savings deposits, and also, what is it called? Let's see. Money market mutual funds. Okay. Okay. So a lot of you, so everyone should know what a savings deposit is. It's just like a checking deposit, but the idea is that with a savings deposit, it takes a little more effort and time to get your money out than it does with a checking deposit. Okay. Turns out with like online banking, it's not quite as true as it used to be 30 years ago. But for that reason, M2 is stuff that is not as quickly transferred into money. So one is the savings deposits. The other, there's something. Okay, real quickly. So first, you should know what a mutual fund is, and I realize a lot of you probably don't. You should know what stocks and bonds are. Okay, so with the stock, if I own one share of stock in, say, Apple, I don't know how many total shares Apple has. It's probably something like 100 million shares. And so if I own one share of Apple stock, that means I own 1/100 million of the company. Okay. Bonds, what those are means that you pay a certain amount. So you buy a government bond. I buy a government bond for $1,000, and then this bond will say something like, the one who owns this bond will get 5% of this bond every year. So 5% of 1,000, what's that, $50? It would say that I get a check from the government, $50 every year for the life of this bond. Usually it's something like 20 years that you own that. And then at the end of the 20 years, you get your $1,000 back. Okay, so it's like you giving a loan to the government. Now, there's also corporate bonds. So it's like you giving a loan to a corporation. So those are what bonds are. Okay, now um, there's something called a mutual fund, and this is where just some company or some person says, "Look, I'm going to buy a bunch of these stocks, a bunch of these bonds. I'm going to have this portfolio of stocks and bonds, and then I'm going to let people buy into this." So something like if if you turn in 1/100th of the total value of this, you'll own 1/100th of the total portfolio, and that's called a mutual fund. This is where you own part of a portfolio of stocks and bonds. Okay, now there's lots of mutual funds. I encourage everyone go to a Vanguard or Fidelity. That's the best place. If you have some extra money you want to save, I encourage you go to one of those two companies. They're the best. They have the lowest fees of anyone, and that's where I strongly encourage people. If you want to invest in the stock market, do that. Use mutual funds. Um, now, the problem with the mutual fund, it usually takes a little bit of time to get your money out. So if I have a mutual fund. So if I want to take money out, I've got to call up Vanguard, turns out, ask them, I would like to sell shares. They say, well, okay, we will sell your shares at whatever the price of the mutual fund is at the end of the day. And according to how many shares you tell us to sell, we will send you a check for that amount. At the end of the day, it may take a couple days to get to you. Okay, so I can take out money from these mutual funds, but it may take a while. Okay, um, there's something called the money market mutual fund, which is a mutual fund that says, look, you don't even have to call us up to take your money out. We'll give you a checkbook, and you can just write checks that give money to other people, just like you would with a checking account. Now, usually, though, they have some restrictions on it. So something like you must keep, you can only write checks on 30% of the money that's currently in the fund, or there's a fee whenever you write one of these checks. So it's not as convenient as quick as a checking deposit. But there are things that they call them money market mutual funds that are kind of like a checking account, but your money is in a mutual fund. And by the way, a checking account, if you do nothing, if you don't take any money out or put any money in, you have the same amount. With a money market mutual fund, it can rise and fall according to whether those stocks or bonds rise or fall in value. Okay, so that's money market mutual fund. That's included in M2. The key point is that money is a little nebulous, a little hard to define. The government has a few ways, economists have a few ways of trying to define it and measure it. The most direct way is M1, and another way is M2, which is just M1 plus some other stuff. Okay, I want you to remember that. Okay, so I could easily ask a question, what is M1? Okay, and you have to say this is a way to measure money supply, and it's the thing that's most direct and the most simple forms of money. M2 includes some more complicated forms. Okay, so that's point one. Okay. Um, okay, next thing, something called partial reserve banking. Okay, now I told you we had that example of the goldsmith. So the goldsmith has 100 ounces of gold at his shop, but he decides to lend out 40. Okay, that means he's only keeping in reserve the 60. Okay, he's not keeping the 100. So when we say he has less than 100, we call that partial reserve. His reserves are only 60% of the total money of the accounts that are with his goldsmith shop. Okay, that happens with every bank. So when you put a deposit, so you bring in money, say dollar bills or coins, whatever, you deposit it at a bank, checking account or savings account, the bank will not keep all of that money at its bank. In its vault, it only keeps, as the book mentions, it's only something like 10% of the money. Okay, it's actually a pretty small amount. Um, and we call this partial reserve banking. Okay, now the problem with this is what happens if everyone at once comes to get their money? So the bank is fine if only a few people per day come in and ask for their money. They say, "Oh yeah, we've got the money in the vault. Here, I'll give it to you." Um, what if the bank, say, has $100 million in deposits, but only keeps 10 million in the bank? What happens if 11 enough people come in asking for 11 million? They don't have it all. And I wanted you to see the scene from the movie "It's a Wonderful Life." Great movie, shown every Christmas. What happened was that someone forgot to renew the copyright, and so anyone who wants to show that movie can show it for free, and that's why you see it so often uh, on television around Christmas time. Um, but the great scene is that where there's a run on the bank. So not only do banks have partial reserves, so you think back to that bank that has $100 million in deposits. Okay, it owes that money to depositors. It only keeps 10 million in the vault. What happens if people come to withdraw 9 million? Okay, if all of a sudden you saw that, oh my gosh, there's about to be 9 million withdrawn. There's only going to be 1 million left. What if more people do that? I better go very quickly to get my money out of the bank. And you saw that during the Depression all the time. People started getting scared that their money wouldn't, that the bank wouldn't have enough money to get out. Word gets around, people panic, and they rush the bank. And that's what happened in that scene in It's a Wonderful Life. Okay. Now, the government, to try to avoid that, there's certain things that they do. The banks are regulated, and they includes they must keep a minimum reserve ratio. And as the book mentions, it probably varies according to how risky your loans are and so forth, but it's something like 10%. So the amount of money that the bank must keep in the vault is about 10% of all their deposits that they have. Um, okay, so great. So we've talked about partial reserve. I'm going to make these parts a little shorter for this session. Okay, so that was part C. Okay, I'll see you in part D.